When my son cut me out of his life, I didn't fight it. I didn't explain myself. I stayed silent and let that silence decide how the story would end. People think silence means weakness. It doesn't. It means you're done explaining yourself to people who already made their decision. The moment my son walked away, I realized something important. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. So I made one too. Paragraph 1, when he walked away. Act 1. The moment my son cut me out of his life did not arrive with drama. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no final argument that could be replayed later to make sense of how things fell apart. It came quietly, wrapped in the kind of calm that feels heavier than anger. We were standing near the front door of my house, the same door I had opened for him countless times over the years, late nights, early mornings, unexpected visits, moments when he needed something or simply needed to know he wasn't alone. That day, the door stood between us, like a boundary that had already been decided. He spoke carefully, as if the words had been practiced. "I think it's better if we don't stay in touch," he said. No accusation, no explanation, just a statement, delivered with a certainty that suggested the conversation had already happened elsewhere, without me. His eyes didn't search my face for a reaction. They drifted slightly past me, toward the street, toward a future he had already stepped into mentally. For a few seconds, I didn't respond. Not because I was shocked, but because I was absorbing the finality of it. Parents are conditioned to believe every distance can be closed, every conflict softened with enough patience. But there are moments when patience is no longer an invitation, it's a liability. This was one of those moments. I asked him a single question. "Is this what you want?" He hesitated, not long enough to reconsider, but long enough to confirm something important. This was not entirely his idea. It was a conclusion he had accepted, reinforced, repeated, until it felt like his own. When he finally nodded, the decision settled into the space between us, solid and unmoving. "I need space," he added, as if space were a neutral concept, as if it didn't carry weight, consequences, or direction. I thought about everything I could say, about the years compressed into a single exchange, about the nights I stayed awake worrying about his future while quietly rearranging my own, about the sacrifices that never feel like sacrifices until they're dismissed as irrelevant. None of it mattered now. Explanations only work when the other person is still listening. So I didn't argue. I nodded once, slowly. "If that's what you need," I said. That surprised him. I saw it in the way his shoulders relaxed, in the faint relief that crossed his face. He had expected resistance, guilt, negotiation. Parents are predictable that way. When none of that came, he didn't know what to do with the moment. He stepped outside, paused briefly, then walked away without looking back. The sound of his footsteps faded, and the quiet that followed was not empty. It was decisive. I closed the door and stood there longer than I realized. The house felt different, not lonelier, just altered, like a room after furniture has been removed, familiar, but changed enough to demand attention. I understood then that something had ended, not because it was destroyed, but because it had reached a conclusion. That night, I didn't replay the conversation. I didn't dissect it line by line, searching for a different outcome. Instead, I noticed something unexpected, a sense of stillness, the kind that comes when a long, unspoken tension finally resolves itself. The waiting was over. The uncertainty had chosen a direction. And in that stillness, a thought surfaced clear and steady. If my son had chosen distance, then distance would be honest. If he had cut me out, then I would not force myself back in. I would let silence do what arguments never could. I went to bed knowing one thing with certainty. The story was no longer about being included. It was about what happens when you stop chasing a place in someone else's life and start deciding what your own will look like without them. Silence doesn't arrive all at once. It expands. At first, it's just the absence of noise where something familiar used to be a phone that doesn't ring, a message that never arrives. You tell yourself, it's temporary. That space is needed. That distance will soften into something manageable. But then days pass, then weeks, and slowly, silence becomes a presence of its own. The first few mornings I woke up expecting to hear from him. Not consciously, habit does that on its own. My hand would reach for the phone before my mind caught up. There were no missed calls, no half-written messages, just an empty screen reflecting a version of me that hadn't adjusted yet. Iletidbe. Breaking silence too early turns it into desperation. I refused to do that. If distance was what he wanted, then distance would be complete, clean, undisturbed by guilt or reminders. I didn't reach out through family. I didn't ask mutual friends to check in. Silence, if it's going to mean anything, has to be respected fully. What surprised me was how quickly the world rearranged itself around my absence. Family conversations continued without me. Plans were made without consideration. I learned about events after they happened, mentioned casually as if my exclusion were a detail too small to matter. No one asked if I was all right. No one wondered how I was taking it. That told me the story had already been explained, told in a way that made my silence look like confirmation rather than restraint. I began to listen differently. When people believe you've accepted a role, they speak freely around you. They explain less. They assume more. In their certainty, they reveal things they never would have said outright. I heard frustration disguised as concern. I heard impatience framed as practicality. And beneath it all, I heard something unmistakable: expectation. Expectation is dangerous when it goes unexamined. I noticed that when my name came up, it was in reference to logistics, not emotion, timing, decisions, outcomes. No one spoke about reconciliation or healing. They spoke about moving forward, as if forward could only exist in one direction, and as if my role in that future had already been decided. That was when I understood this wasn't a pause. It was a recalibration. My son wasn't taking time to reflect. He was adjusting his life to function without my presence and without my influence. That kind of adjustment doesn't happen accidentally. It requires reinforcement, validation, someone else agreeing that distance is not only acceptable, but necessary. The silence sharpened my awareness. Without the constant pull of trying to maintain a relationship, I began to see patterns I had ignored before. How often conversations had revolved around expectations rather than connection. How often my role had quietly shifted from father to facilitator. How often patience had been mistaken for availability. I didn't feel angry. Anger needs friction. This was something else, something colder, clearer. I began to ask myself questions I hadn't allowed before. Not what did I do wrong, but what was I tolerating? Not how do I fix this, but why was I the only one trying to? Those questions didn't accuse anyone. They simply rebalanced the weight of responsibility. Days settled into a new rhythm. I walked more, read without distraction, slept better than I had in years. That, more than anything, unsettled me. Peace arrived sooner than I expected. Not happiness, peace. The absence of tension you don't realize you've been carrying until it's gone. Silence, I learned, isn't empty. It's revealing. And what it revealed was simple and uncomfortable. My son had not stepped away because he needed space. He had stepped away because he believed he no longer needed me. That belief would shape everything that came next. My son had not always been like this. That was the part that stayed with me the longest. The part that refused to be rewritten no matter how many explanations people offered. He had once been thoughtful in a quiet way. The kind of person who listened more than he spoke, who asked questions before forming opinions. He wasn't perfect, but he was grounded. He doubted himself just enough to remain fair, and trusted himself just enough to keep moving forward. That balance didn't disappear overnight. It was eroded. At first, the change was subtle. He became more impatient, quicker to conclude conversations. He started finishing my sentences, correcting small details that didn't need correcting. I told myself it was confidence, the natural shift that happens when a child becomes an adult and wants to assert independence. Parents are trained to see growth even when something else is happening underneath. Then, the language changed. He began using words that felt borrowed rather than lived in. Terms that sounded rehearsed, repeated with conviction but without depth. Concepts like boundaries, control, and emotional responsibility appeared suddenly, always applied outward, never inward. When I asked him what he meant, his explanations were vague, circular. That told me the ideas hadn't originated with him. They had been absorbed. The first time he accused me of being too involved, I was genuinely confused. Involvement had always been welcome, encouraged, requested. But now it was framed as interference. Context had shifted, and I had missed the moment it happened. I noticed how decisions were no longer discussed. They were announced. Plans arrived fully formed, as if my input had become unnecessary, even inconvenient. When I asked questions, his tone sharpened slightly, not hostile, just defensive. Defense is what people adopt when they feel justified, but not secure. There was someone else reinforcing that justification. I didn't recognize it immediately, because influence rarely looks like control. It looks like agreement, like support, like someone saying, "You're right to feel this way," often enough that doubt loses its footing. My son wasn't being ordered to change. He was being reassured that change was overdue. Conversations that once happened privately between us were now filtered. His responses felt mediated, as if he were reporting conclusions rather than exploring thoughts. When I pressed gently, he withdrew. When I backed off, he seemed relieved. That relief told me more than his words ever could. The more distance grew, the more certain he became. Certainty, without reflection, is always suspect. It doesn't come from understanding, it comes from reinforcement. Someone else had helped him reach these conclusions, had framed them as necessary, even healthy, and once he accepted that framing, everything I said was reinterpreted through it. I replayed old conversations in my mind with new clarity. Moments that had felt harmless before now carried weight. Questions about the future, comments about independence, casual remarks that hinted at impatience rather than concern. None of it had seemed threatening in isolation. Together, it formed a pattern. By the time he told me he needed distance, the decision had already hardened. He wasn't seeking space to think. He was seeking confirmation that the separation was justified. My reaction, calm, accepting, silent, gave him exactly that. And that was when I understood something difficult but necessary. This wasn't about conflict. It wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about influence, replacing reflection. And once reflection is gone, distance feels not only reasonable but righteous. Influence doesn't push, it pulls. It doesn't demand, it reframes. Looking back, I could see how carefully the ground had been prepared before my son ever spoke the words that cut me out of his life. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was loud. The separation was cultivated, one reasonable thought at a time, until the conclusion felt inevitable. She never spoke badly about me outright. That would have raised alarms. Instead, she asked questions that sounded thoughtful, even protective. Don't you think it would be healthier if you had clearer boundaries? Isn't it stressful to feel responsible for someone else's expectations? Each question planted a seed, not of anger, but of justification. Justification is far more durable. I remembered dinners where conversation drifted toward the future. Plans, stability, what life should look like by a certain age. The emphasis was always on certainty, predictable outcomes, streamlined decisions, fewer complications. I noticed how often my role in those discussions was framed as temporary, transitional, something that would naturally fade once things were settled. The word settled did a lot of work. My son began to nod more than he spoke. That nodding mattered. It wasn't agreement born of conviction. It was acceptance born of fatigue. Fatigue makes people receptive. When someone offers a clean explanation for discomfort, it feels like relief. The discomfort doesn't have to be examined, only redirected. The pressure increased quietly after that. Not pressure on him, but pressure around him. Comparisons to other families, other parents, other lives that looked simpler, more autonomous. They don't have to deal with this. They're free to make their own choices. Freedom, framed that way, sounds irresistible. It also sounds earned, even when it isn't. I noticed how his visits changed. He stayed shorter. Conversations turned practical. He asked fewer questions about my life and more about logistics. documents, timelines, what-ifs. The questions were careful, respectful in tone, but persistent in presence. They assumed a direction. They assumed inevitability. Assumptions are dangerous when they go unchallenged. I didn't challenge them. Not yet. What struck me most was how often concern was used as cover. We just don't want this to be hard on you. We're thinking about what's best for everyone. Concern offered after conclusions are reached isn't concern at all, it's management. My son didn't see that. He heard reassurance. He heard permission. By the time he stood at my door and asked for distance, he wasn't rejecting me as a father. He was resolving a problem as it had been presented to him. I had been reframed from relationship to obstacle, from presence to complication. Once that shift happens, decisions feel justified no matter how final they are. Understanding that didn't make me angry. It made me patient. Because influence that relies on framing collapses when the frame no longer holds. And frames only hold as long as everyone agrees to keep them in place. Silence, I realized, was already loosening it. Without resistance to push against, the narrative had nothing to define itself by. They believed distance would make me pliable. They believed isolation would weaken me. They had misunderstood the nature of both. Distance gave me clarity. Isolation gave me time. And time, when you are no longer trying to convince anyone of anything, becomes an asset. Once I stopped trying to explain myself, my attention shifted naturally to observation. It wasn't deliberate at first. I didn't sit down and decide to analyze anyone. It happened because silence created space, and in that space, details became impossible to ignore. When you're no longer defending your intentions, you begin to see other people's clearly. The first thing I noticed was timing. Messages didn't come randomly anymore. They arrived when something was needed, when a decision had to be made, when reassurance was required. Not emotional reassurance, practical reassurance, confirmation, agreement, movement. I had been reduced to a checkpoint, not a person. That realization didn't hurt as much as I expected. It clarified. The second thing was tone. Requests were framed as inevitabilities. When this happens, after we move forward, the language assumed cooperation before it was given. That kind of assumption only appears when someone believes resistance is unlikely. They didn't ask whether something could be done. They spoke as if it already had been. The third thing was patience, or the lack of it. Each time I delayed a response, even slightly, irritation crept in. Not openly, subtly. A tighter sentence, a shorter reply. Politeness stretched thin. People with clean intentions don't mind waiting. People relying on momentum do. I began asking small questions, nothing confrontational. Clarifying questions. Questions that required specificity. The answers were often vague. Explanation shifted depending on who was speaking. What had been urgent one week became flexible the next, then urgent again when it suited them. Consistency was missing, and inconsistency always points somewhere. Entitlement doesn't announce itself loudly. It appears in expectations that go unexamined, in plans made without confirmation, in futures spoken about as if they belong to someone else by default. I heard it when my son spoke about what made sense, about what should happen next. He spoke as though outcomes were already agreed upon, as though the only remaining step was execution. What unsettled me most was how confident he sounded. Not confident in himself, confident in the absence of consequences. He believed distance had closed the door behind him permanently. He believed silence meant acquiescence. That belief made him careless. Carelessness always leaves traces. I noticed contradictions between what was said to me and what was said to others. Small ones, nothing dramatic, but enough to reveal a shifting narrative. Narratives shift when they're built on convenience rather than truth. Keeping track of those shifts required no effort once I stopped trying to correct them. The final realization came quietly. I wasn't being pushed out because I was difficult. I was being edged aside because I was in the way. Once that became clear, my role in the situation changed entirely. I was no longer reacting. I was assessing. The emotional weight lifted, replaced by something steadier. Curiosity, calm, Distance. They thought I had stepped back. In reality, I had stopped playing the part they expected me to play. And that was the moment everything truly began to change. There is a moment in every long conflict when explanation stops being communication and starts becoming negotiation. I didn't recognize it at first. For years, I had believed that if I explained myself clearly enough, patiently enough, understanding would follow. That belief is comforting, especially for parents. It allows us to think effort can always repair distance. But effort only works when it is mutual. I noticed the shift when my words stopped changing anything. I would clarify, and nothing would adjust. I would explain, and the explanation would be acknowledged without being absorbed. My intentions were no longer being misunderstood. They were being dismissed. That distinction matters. Misunderstanding invites dialogue. Dismissal ends it. At first, I blamed myself. I wondered if my tone was wrong, if I was choosing the wrong moments, if I was holding on too tightly. Self-examination is healthy, but it becomes destructive when it replaces accountability on the other side. I was reviewing myself while no one else was reviewing their expectations. The truth arrived quietly. People don't stop listening because they don't understand. They stop listening because they've already decided. Once that decision is made, explanations serve a different purpose. They're no longer meant to clarify. They're meant to exhaust, to wear you down until you either comply or retreat. I recognized that pattern too late, but recognition was enough. So I stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically. I simply stopped volunteering reasons. I stopped defending choices that didn't require defense. When asked questions framed as persuasion, I responded with neutrality. When pressed for justification, I offered patience instead of detail. Silence is not emptiness. It's refusal to participate in a conversation that has already reached its conclusion. The effect was immediate. Confusion replaced certainty. Without my explanations to push against, their arguments lost shape. They began repeating themselves, adjusting tone, rephrasing the same points in different ways. That repetition revealed something important. The conversation wasn't evolving because it wasn't meant to. It was meant to end with my agreement. I no longer provided that endpoint. Stopping explanation also did something unexpected for me. It returned my energy. Explaining yourself constantly is exhausting because it places you in a defensive position, even when you've done nothing wrong. Once I stopped, the exhaustion lifted. I slept better, thought more clearly, made decisions without anticipating how they would be received. That clarity changed my posture. I was no longer leaning into conversations, hoping to be understood. I was standing still, allowing others to decide how they wanted to approach me. Some stepped back. Some grew impatient. A few attempted warmth where there had been none before. Each reaction told me exactly where I stood. Silence did not solve the conflict, but it revealed its shape. And once the shape was clear, I understood what had to come next. Not confrontation, not persuasion. Alignment with myself, with my boundaries, with the reality of what the relationship had become. I wasn't withdrawing to punish anyone. I was withdrawing because I had finished explaining. There is a strange advantage in being misjudged. When people believe they understand you completely, they stop paying attention. I didn't correct the version of myself they had settled on. I let it exist. In their minds, I was tired, confused, quiet because I had nothing left to say. That assumption made them comfortable. Comfort breeds carelessness. I began to respond more slowly. Not evasively, just without urgency. Messages went unanswered for hours, sometimes days. When I did reply, I kept my words brief and non-committal. I asked questions that sounded uncertain. I expressed mild hesitation where there was none. Each small signal reinforced the image they had already created. They leaned into it. My son's tone softened, but not with warmth, with reassurance. He explained things to me as if I were struggling to keep up. He repeated himself, simplifying points that didn't need simplification. He thanked me in advance for cooperation I hadn't given. That gratitude, premature and presumptive, revealed how far ahead he believed himself to be. She followed a different approach. Where he offered reassurance, she offered concern. carefully worded messages about stress, about wanting to make things easier for everyone. She spoke about balance and peace, about how difficult conflict could be at this stage of life. The implication was subtle but clear. Resistance would only make things harder for me. I thanked her. Gratitude is disarming. It signals acceptance without agreement. It invites further assumption. They began to speak more freely after that, outlining plans that were no longer hypothetical. Timelines were mentioned casually. Outcomes were discussed as if they were already settled. My role in those outcomes was described as passive, almost incidental. I listened. Every conversation confirmed the same belief on their side. That silence meant surrender. That distance had worn me down. That patience had turned into resignation. They mistook restraint for weakness, and weakness, once assumed, invites acceleration. They began to rush. Deadlines appeared. Decisions were framed as time-sensitive. Urgency crept into their messages, not because circumstances had changed, but because they believed the end was near. When people think victory is close, they stop guarding their words. That was when mistakes began to surface. Details slipped. Assumptions were stated openly. Expectations were voiced without qualification. They spoke as if the future belonged to them already, as if my consent were a formality rather than a requirement. That confidence told me everything I needed to know. I was no longer reacting to their moves. I was watching them make their own. Letting them believe I was weak did not diminish me. It simplified the situation. It clarified motivations. It revealed how much of their certainty depended on my continued silence. They were building momentum on the assumption that I would not interrupt it. They were right about one thing. I wasn't going to interrupt it. I was going to let it run its course. Silence stopped being a reaction and became a choice. That distinction changed everything. Until then, my restraint had been interpreted as emotional withdrawal. Now, it was intentional, directed. I wasn't waiting for clarity anymore. I was creating it. I stopped responding in real time. Not to punish anyone, but to remove myself from the rhythm they were setting. Urgency is a tool people use when they want momentum to replace consent. By refusing to match their pace, I forced the situation to slow down. Slowness unsettles people who depend on assumptions. It exposes how little is actually agreed upon. I noticed how often they filled the gaps themselves. When I didn't answer, they speculated. When I didn't confirm, they reassured each other. When I didn't resist, they accelerated. Silence doesn't stop people from acting. It encourages them to reveal how they act when they think no one is watching. In that sense, silence became my most reliable source of information. They began to explain things unprompted. Long messages appeared, layered with justification. Reasons stacked on reasons, each one trying to sound more reasonable than the last. Justification is a sign of insecurity. People who are confident in their position don't need to keep explaining it. The volume of explanation told me how fragile their certainty really was. I stayed consistent. My replies, when they came, were neutral, calm, non-confrontational. I acknowledged without agreeing. I thanked without committing. I expressed understanding without offering permission. That balance confused them. They were used to conversations moving toward resolution. This one remained suspended. Suspension created pressure. Without a clear endpoint, they didn't know when to push or when to wait. They tried both. They softened their tone, then sharpened it. They appealed to reason, then to emotion. Each shift revealed a new strategy, and each strategy depended on the same assumption that I would eventually step in and resolve the discomfort. I didn't. Instead, I paid attention to what silence gave me back: time, space, perspective. Without constant engagement, my decisions felt lighter. I wasn't anticipating reactions or rehearsing explanations. I was thinking clearly, assessing outcomes rather than arguments. That clarity allowed me to separate what was urgent from what was merely presented as urgent. Most of what they wanted fell into the second category. I realized then that silence wasn't passive at all. It was active restraint. It prevented me from being pulled into conversations designed to exhaust rather than resolve. It protected my energy. It shifted the burden of movement entirely onto them. And under that burden, their confidence began to crack. They asked more questions, repeated old ones, circled back to points they thought had been settled. Each return revealed doubt. Each doubt revealed dependency. They needed my participation to complete the narrative they had built. Without it, the structure felt unstable. That instability marked the beginning of change. I hadn't confronted anyone. I hadn't demanded anything. I hadn't explained myself. I had simply stopped moving. And in doing so, I had forced the entire situation to reveal its true weight. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no moment where I could point and say, "This is where everything changed." That's how irreversible decisions usually work. They slide into place quietly, almost unnoticed, until one day you realize there is no path back to where you started. It began with a simple realization. I no longer felt the urge to check in, not out of pride, not out of anger. The urge was simply gone. That absence mattered more than any argument ever could. Wanting to explain, to reach out, to be understood, those impulses had powered my role in the relationship for years. When they disappeared, something fundamental shifted. I noticed it one morning while making coffee. The thought of him crossed my mind, but it didn't pull at me. It didn't create urgency or anxiety. It was just a thought, allowed to pass without demanding action. That was when I understood that the emotional dependency had loosened. Detachment doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop centering your life around someone else's reactions. From that point on, my decisions stopped factoring in how they would be perceived. I didn't ask myself whether something would cause tension or whether silence would be misread. I asked only whether a choice aligned with the life I wanted to live. That simplification was liberating. They noticed the change before I did. Messages grew shorter, more cautious. Questions were phrased differently, as if testing unfamiliar ground. The confidence that had once filled their words was replaced by something tentative. They sensed the loss of leverage, even if they couldn't name it. My son reached out again, casually, as if nothing fundamental had happened. He spoke about everyday things, testing whether familiarity could be reintroduced without addressing the distance. I responded politely, briefly. I didn't reopen doors. I didn't close them either. I simply stood where I was. That neutrality unsettled him. People are accustomed to predictable reactions. Anger, forgiveness, argument, these all provide orientation. Neutrality offers none. It leaves the other person unsure of where they stand, unsure of how much influence they still have. I wasn't trying to unsettle anyone. I was simply no longer adjusting myself to make things easier for them. The most telling moment came when a small request was made, something that, in the past, I would have agreed to without hesitation. Not because I was obligated, but because it felt natural. This time, I paused, not outwardly, internally. And in that pause, I realized I didn't want to do it. So I didn't. There was no explanation, no justification, just a polite decline. The response on the other end was immediate confusion. A follow-up question, a reminder of how things used to be. That was when it became clear. They hadn't noticed my silence because they thought it was temporary. They hadn't taken my restraint seriously. They had been waiting for me to return to my role. I wasn't going to. That was the point of no return. Not because of what I did, but because of what I no longer felt compelled to do. The relationship, as it had existed, depended on my constant availability, emotional, practical, and psychological. Without that availability, it could not function the same way. And I was at peace with that. Assumptions are comfortable because they allow people to move quickly without questioning the ground beneath them. For a long time, everyone involved had operated on the same one. That silence was temporary, that distance would soften, that I would eventually return to the role I had always played. When that assumption stopped holding, the structure built on top of it began to wobble. The first sign was confusion. Questions arrived that didn't quite know what they were asking. Messages that circled around a point without landing on it. There was an unfamiliar hesitation in the way my son spoke, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. He was adjusting his tone in real time, trying to locate the version of me he thought still existed. I didn't help him find it. People around us began to notice the shift as well. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because the usual patterns were no longer repeating. Plans that once assumed my involvement no longer mentioned it. Decisions that had counted on my availability quietly revised themselves. The absence of my participation forced others to confront the reality they had avoided. Things only worked the way they did because I made them work. That realization carried discomfort. Discomfort often looks like irritation at first. Small remarks, impatience disguised as practicality, subtle pressure to smooth things over. I heard it in passing comments, in suggestions that it might be easier if everyone just moved on. Moving on, in this context, meant returning to what was familiar. I didn't. What followed was recalibration. Without my automatic agreement, timelines stretched. Outcomes became uncertain. Responsibility redistributed itself unevenly. Where assumptions had once filled the gaps, effort was now required. Effort exposed weaknesses. Weaknesses exposed disagreements that had previously been masked by convenience. My son felt that pressure most clearly. He began to realize how much of his certainty had rested on the belief that I would eventually step in. Not to rescue him, but to stabilize things quietly, the way I always had. Without that stabilizing force, he was left to manage complexity on his own. He didn't like that. But discomfort is not injustice, it's adjustment. There were moments when I sensed resentment forming not toward the situation, but toward me, for not correcting it. That resentment told me everything I needed to know. It confirmed that silence had been mistaken for obligation and distance for weakness. I remained steady, not cold, not indifferent, just steady. Steadiness, in situations like this, acts like a mirror. It reflects expectations back to the people who hold them. When those expectations can't be met, frustration has nowhere to go but inward. That was when the collapse became undeniable. Not dramatic, not explosive. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the story everyone had been telling themselves no longer matched reality. They didn't say it out loud. They didn't have to. Their behavior said it for them. And once assumptions fall away, only truth remains. Need returns quietly. It doesn't arrive with apologies or confessions. It arrives disguised as conversation, as a casual check-in that carries more weight than it admits. I recognized it immediately. Not because of what was said, but because of how it was said. The pauses were longer. The tone was careful. The certainty that once carried the conversation was gone. My son called one evening, later than usual. He didn't ask how I was right away. He spoke about ordinary things, first work, schedules, minor frustrations. It felt rehearsed, like someone warming up before approaching a subject they weren't sure how to name. I let him speak. Silence, at this stage, had taught me patience. Eventually, he paused. "I could use your perspective," he said, "not help." Perspective. The word mattered. It was a way of reaching without admitting dependence, of asking without lowering himself too far. I didn't respond immediately, not to create tension, but because I wanted to answer honestly. Honesty, I had learned, didn't require speed. "What are you trying to decide?" I asked. He hesitated, then explained, vaguely at first, then with increasing clarity. Plans weren't moving the way he expected. Decisions felt heavier. Outcomes were less predictable. He spoke about complexity as if it were an inconvenience rather than a reality. What he didn't say was just as telling. He didn't mention the assumptions he had built those plans on. He was asking for stability. I listened without interrupting. I didn't correct him. I didn't offer solutions. When he finished, there was another pause, heavier than the last. "I thought you might have some insight," he added. I did. But insight given too early becomes instruction. And instruction, in this context, would have restored the very dynamic I had stepped away from. I chose my words carefully. "I can share how I think about decisions," I said, "but I won't make them for you." That boundary landed quietly between us. He accepted it without comment, which told me how much had changed. There was a time when he would have pushed back, challenged, negotiated. Now, he listened. We spoke for a while after that, not about outcomes, but about process, about slowing down, about questioning assumptions, about recognizing where certainty comes from And where it doesn't, I kept my voice even. I offered no guarantees. When the call ended, I felt no sense of triumph, only confirmation. They didn't need me the way they once had. They needed what I represented: stability, perspective, patience. And those things, once removed, are not easily replaced. I didn't chase the moment. I didn't reopen old conversations. I let it stand on its own. Need, once acknowledged, changes the balance whether or not it's satisfied. That night, I slept deeply, not because something had been resolved, but because something had been recognized. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it settles into a room the way light does, gradually, without demand, until everything else adjusts around it. I felt that shift in the days that followed our conversation, not because anyone said anything different, but because no one tried to move me anymore. Requests stopped sounding like expectations. Conversations no longer leaned on urgency. There was a carefulness now, a subtle respect that hadn't existed before. It wasn't admiration, and it wasn't reconciliation. It was recognition. Recognition that I was no longer positioned to be steered. I didn't correct anyone's behavior. I didn't point out the change. Power that needs acknowledgement weakens itself. Instead, I stayed consistent. Calm replies. Clear boundaries. No emotional explanations. The consistency did the work for me. My son reached out again, briefly, to share an update. Not to seek approval, just to inform. That distinction mattered. It meant he was beginning to understand the difference between autonomy and isolation. He was learning to carry his own decisions without expecting them to be absorbed by someone else. When we spoke, I didn't lead. I didn't advise unless asked. And when asked, I spoke about principles, not outcomes, about patience over speed, about choosing clarity instead of certainty. Those ideas don't give people answers, they give them tools. Tools encourage independence. Answers invite dependence. I noticed something else as well. I no longer felt the need to manage his emotions. In the past, I had softened truths, delayed boundaries, adjusted myself to keep peace. That habit was gone, not because I was hardened, but because I had learned that peace built on self-erasure doesn't last. There were moments when the old pattern tried to return. A subtle hint, an indirect appeal, a reminder of shared history. I didn't reject those moments. I simply didn't follow them. Nostalgia can be a powerful lever when it's used to reopen doors that were closed for a reason. What surprised me most was how natural this new balance felt. I had expected distance to feel sharp, to cut into daily life. Instead, it created definition. I knew where I ended and where others began. That clarity made interactions lighter, not heavier. There was less tension because there were fewer unspoken expectations. Power, I realized, isn't about control. It's about choice. The ability to engage without obligation, to respond without fear, to say yes or no without rehearsing the consequences. That ability had returned to me quietly, the moment I stopped trying to preserve a version of the relationship that no longer existed. I didn't win anything. I simply stopped losing myself. There is a moment when distance stops feeling temporary and starts feeling structural. It's not announced. No one says, "This is how it will be from now on." You simply notice that the rhythm has stabilized. No spikes, no sudden drops. Just a steady, predictable space between you and the life you once moved inside without thinking. That was when I understood the distance wasn't waiting to be closed. It had settled. Weeks passed without urgency. Conversations became infrequent but consistent. Holidays came and went quietly. I was informed, not invited. The difference mattered less than I expected. Information carries no expectation. Invitations do. Without expectation, there is no pressure to perform, to show up as a version of yourself designed to make others comfortable. I adjusted without resistance. My days filled themselves naturally. The time that had once been absorbed by anticipation, waiting for messages, preparing explanations, managing reactions, returned to me. I spent it on things that didn't ask anything in return. Long walks, old books, Conversations that didn't require me to prove my worth to remain welcome. The permanence of the distance brought a strange sense of relief. Uncertainty is exhausting. It keeps you braced, alert, always preparing for change. Permanence, even when it isn't ideal, allows you to relax. You stop scanning the horizon for signs of reconciliation or rupture. You accept the shape of the present and live inside it. My son adapted as well. He stopped reaching out impulsively. When he did contact me, it was deliberate, measured. There was a new respect in that restraint, not warmth respect. He no longer assumed access. He no longer spoke as if my presence were guaranteed. He had learned, slowly and without being told, that relationships don't resume on demand. I noticed how his life had grown louder without me. Responsibilities pressed closer. Decisions carried weight. There was no buffer anymore, no quiet figure absorbing uncertainty in the background. He was learning what autonomy actually requires, not freedom from others, but accountability to yourself. I didn't comment on it. Commentary would have shifted the balance again. Silence allowed the lesson to belong to him. There were moments of nostalgia, of course. Memory doesn't disappear just because a relationship changes. Certain dates still carried echoes. Certain places still felt layered with past conversations. But memory no longer dictated action. It existed as history, not instruction. I understood then that permanence doesn't mean finality. It means stability. Stability is underrated. People chase resolution, closure, reconciliation. Stability asks for none of that. It simply holds. It allows life to continue without constant negotiation. This distance had become stable, and stability, I realized, was enough. Entitlement doesn't always look like arrogance. More often, it looks like expectation left unexamined. It's the quiet belief that certain things will always be there. Support, approval, availability, simply because they always have been. My son had grown up inside that belief without realizing it. I had helped build it, not intentionally, but through consistency, through being present, through making things work. When that presence was removed, the belief didn't vanish immediately. It lingered, testing the edges of reality, waiting for the world to correct itself. That waiting carried a cost. I saw it in the way decisions became heavier for him. Choices that once felt straightforward now required deliberation. Without an assumed safety net, every option carried visible weight. He began to hesitate where he once moved quickly, to question where he once assumed. That hesitation wasn't weakness. It was recalibration. Entitlement dissolves slowly. At first, it resists. It looks for substitutes, other voices, other assurances. When those don't hold, it turns inward. That inward turn is uncomfortable. It forces a reckoning with responsibility not as an abstract idea, but as a daily practice. I noticed how often he now spoke about stress, not dramatically, casually, as if mentioning it might lighten it. He talked about pressure at work, about plans that didn't unfold as expected, about the effort required to keep everything moving. He didn't frame these things as complaints. He framed them as facts. That shift mattered. Facts invite adaptation. Complaints invite rescue. I didn't rescue him. Not because I couldn't, because I shouldn't. Rescue would have restored entitlement by another name. It would have taught him that distance has no consequences, that words spoken in certainty can be walked back without cost. That lesson would have done more harm than any silence ever could. Entitlement also has a social cost. Without the quiet, stabilizing presence I once provided, disagreements that had been smoothed over became visible. Expectations between people grew misaligned. Responsibility, once diffused, concentrated unevenly. That unevenness created friction. Friction forced conversations that could no longer be avoided. I stayed outside those conversations. Distance, once permanent, protects everyone involved from repeating old patterns. I didn't offer commentary. I didn't analyze outcomes. Analysis can sound like judgment when it isn't invited. Instead, I listened when asked, and I spoke only about principles, never about blame. What surprised me was how entitlement, once exposed, began to give way to something else. Humility. Not the performative kind, the quiet kind that arrives when reality refuses to bend. My son became more measured, less certain, more thoughtful. He didn't announce this change. He lived into it slowly, through trial and error, through missteps and corrections. That growth came at a price, but it was a fair one. The cost of entitlement is adjustment. The benefit is maturity. And maturity, unlike entitlement, doesn't require anyone else to carry it for you. Silence doesn't just remove noise. It removes access. Over time, I realized that what they lost wasn't me in the way they once defined me, but something subtler and far more difficult to replace. They lost immediacy, the ability to assume, the comfort of knowing that someone else would step in before consequences arrived. That loss revealed itself slowly. At first, it showed up as inconvenience. Small things that used to resolve themselves now required effort. Questions that once had obvious answers now lingered. Decisions that had been softened by reassurance now stood alone, exposed to uncertainty. Inconvenience doesn't sound significant, but it accumulates. It changes how people move through their days. Then it became emotional. Without my steady presence, there was no neutral ground to retreat to when tensions rose. No familiar voice to absorb frustration without escalating it. Disagreements had to be faced directly. Feelings had to be named instead of redirected. That shift was uncomfortable, especially for people accustomed to stability they didn't have to maintain. I noticed how often my son now paused before speaking, not because he was afraid, but because he was aware. Awareness changes cadence. It inserts space where certainty once lived. In that space, responsibility has room to appear. Responsibility is heavy when you're not used to carrying it. Silence also took away reassurance. Not the spoken kind, but the unspoken assurance that things would work out because they always had. Without that background certainty, optimism had to be earned through preparation rather than assumed through habit. That adjustment was difficult. It required planning instead of hoping, follow-through instead of expectation. What surprised me most was how silence altered memory. The past, once filtered through familiarity, began to look different. Moments that had been taken for granted gained clarity. Support that had blended into the background became visible by its absence. That visibility wasn't something I pointed out. It emerged on its own, through contrast. I saw it when my son spoke about exhaustion without complaint, when he mentioned complexity without resentment. Those weren't admissions of failure, they were acknowledgments of reality. Reality, once faced, has a way of reorganizing values. Silence also removed shortcuts. There was no longer a way to bypass discomfort by appealing to history. No way to skip difficult conversations by invoking closeness. Everything had to be addressed where it stood. That requirement slowed life down, but it also made it more honest. I didn't celebrate any of this. Loss doesn't need witnesses to be real. It doesn't need to be announced to have impact. It simply exists, reshaping behavior in ways that can't be undone. What silence took from them was not punishment. It was ease. And ease, once gone, forces growth whether or not it's welcomed. Silence gave me myself back. That sounds simple, almost sentimental. But it wasn't. It was practical, measurable. In the space where constant explanation once lived, something steadier took root. I stopped rehearsing conversations that never happened. I stopped preparing defenses for choices that didn't require permission. The mental noise faded, and in its place came a calm I hadn't realized I was missing. The first thing silence returned to me was time, not the empty kind, but the usable kind. Time that didn't feel borrowed from someone else's expectations. Mornings unfolded without urgency. Evenings settled without the weight of unresolved conversations. I found myself lingering over small things, coffee cooling on the table, light shifting across a room without feeling the pull to be elsewhere. That kind of presence is rare when you are constantly needed. Silence also gave me clarity. Without the need to manage anyone else's reactions, my decisions became simpler. Not easier, simpler. I knew why I was choosing what I chose. There was no audience to perform for, no future conversation to anticipate. That alignment between intention and action brought a quiet confidence I hadn't felt in years. I noticed how my posture changed. Not physically, but internally. I was no longer leaning toward anyone, waiting for a cue. I stood where I was. That steadiness affected everything else. Conversations felt lighter. Boundaries required fewer words. When I said yes, it was genuine. When I said no, it was final without being harsh. Silence also gave me discernment. I became more selective about where I placed my energy. I paid attention to how interactions made me feel not in a fragile way, but in a grounded one. Did they require me to shrink, to justify, to smooth things over at my own expense? If they did, I stepped back without explanation. I had learned that not every distance needs a reason. The most unexpected gift was dignity. Not the kind granted by others, but the kind you grant yourself when you stop negotiating your worth. Dignity doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly when you choose self-respect over approval. That choice, once made consistently, reshapes how you move through the world. I didn't become colder. I became clearer. My capacity for empathy remained, but it was no longer entangled with obligation. I could care without carrying, listen without absorbing, offer perspective without being responsible for outcomes. That balance felt sustainable in a way my old way of relating never had. Silence taught me that strength doesn't require presence everywhere. Sometimes strength is choosing where not to stand. And in choosing that, I didn't lose connection. I found peace. Acceptance is often mistaken for forgiveness. People use the words interchangeably, as if one naturally leads to the other. I learned, slowly and without ceremony, that they are not the same. Forgiveness implies repair. Acceptance implies recognition. One seeks restoration. The other seeks truth. What I reached was acceptance. I accepted that my son had made his choices with the information, influences, and assumptions he carried at the time. I accepted that those choices had altered our relationship in ways that could not simply be undone by time or regret. I accepted that the version of us that once existed had completed its chapter. None of that required me to forgive what had been said. Forgiveness, when offered prematurely, becomes another form of self-erasure. It skips over understanding in favor of comfort. I wasn't interested in comfort anymore. I was interested in alignment with myself, with reality, with the limits of what could be rebuilt. I no longer revisited the moment he walked away, not because it stopped mattering, but because it had stopped defining me. Memory doesn't disappear when it's integrated. It loses its sharp edges. The pain softened into context. Context allowed perspective. Perspective allowed peace. When we spoke, there was no resentment in my voice. There didn't need to be. Resentment is energy spent trying to correct the past. I had moved forward without dragging it behind me. That forward motion made bitterness unnecessary. My son sensed the change. He no longer tried to justify himself. He no longer framed distance as necessity or strength. He spoke plainly, carefully. There was humility in that care, not as an apology, but as restraint. Restraint is often the first sign that someone has learned something costly. I didn't demand acknowledgement. Demand would have returned us to negotiation. I wasn't negotiating anything anymore. The terms of my life were set. He could meet them or not. Either outcome was survivable. Acceptance also meant letting go of imagined futures. The version of reconciliation I once held in my mind, the sudden understanding, the emotional conversation, the return to closeness quietly dissolved, not with grief, but with realism. Imagined futures can be heavy when you keep carrying them long after they've expired. Letting go of them freed me. I understood then that closure doesn't require agreement. It requires honesty. Honest assessment of what happened. Honest acceptance of what changed. Honest boundaries around what will not be repeated. Forgiveness may come someday, or it may not. Acceptance was enough. It allowed me to live without waiting for anything to resolve itself. It allowed the story to exist as it was, not as I wished it had been. And in that acceptance, there was no bitterness, only calm. That calm told me I was nearing the end of something, not an ending marked by final words or grand conclusions, but by quiet certainty. Understanding doesn't arrive as a revelation. It arrives as a settling, A quiet alignment between what you know and what you no longer argue with. I felt it one ordinary afternoon, standing by a window, watching nothing in particular. The world outside moved as it always had, indifferent to personal reckonings. That indifference was comforting. It reminded me that my story was not an exception, it was a variation. The understanding was simple. Love that requires self-abandonment is not love. Closeness that depends on silence about your own limits is not connection. And peace that only exists when you remain useful is not peace at all. For years, I had mistaken endurance for virtue. I believed that staying, absorbing, smoothing over, and holding everything together was a form of loyalty. It took distance to show me that loyalty without reciprocity becomes invisibility, not because others intend it to, but because it allows them to forget your edges. I realized then that my son had not taken anything from me. I had given too much without asking whether it was still wanted or respected. That realization did not come with self-blame. Blame implies fault. This was learning. Learning is gentler. It doesn't accuse the past. It reframes it. I could see how my consistency had created comfort for others while quietly erasing myself. I could also see how easily comfort turns into expectation when it's never challenged. The final understanding was not about him. It was about me. About how I move through relationships. About what I offer without condition and what I now reserve with intention. About the difference between generosity and depletion. About the courage required to stop participating in dynamics that depend on your silence. I didn't need anyone else to recognize this truth for it to matter. Recognition from others is validation. Recognition within yourself is transformation. Once that clicked, everything else fell into place. The distance no longer felt like loss. It felt like correction. A course adjustment made late, but not too late. The relationship with my son existed now in a form that matched reality, not hope. And that was honest. Honesty, I learned, is quieter than expectation. It doesn't ask you to wait. It doesn't ask you to prove anything. It simply invites you to stand where you are, without apology. I stood there. Life without the old story felt unfamiliar at first, like wearing clothes that fit differently than you're used to. Nothing was wrong with them. They just didn't carry the same weight. I noticed the difference in small moments when a decision came easily, when I didn't hesitate before choosing myself, when I didn't feel the need to explain why I was unavailable. The old story had been simple. Be patient, be understanding, hold things together. It had given my days structure, even purpose. Letting it go meant facing a quieter question. Who am I when I'm not holding everything up? The answer didn't arrive all at once. It emerged through routine, through choosing what to do with my time without consulting an invisible audience, through discovering that I enjoyed things simply because I enjoyed them, not because they served a role. I read books I had postponed. I revisited places I used to rush through. I allowed days to end without measuring whether I had been useful enough. Usefulness had once been my identity. Now, presence replaced it. I became more attentive to my own signals, fatigue, curiosity, resistance. Where I once pushed past them, I now listened. That listening reshaped my boundaries naturally. I said no earlier. I said yes more deliberately. The world didn't collapse. It adjusted. People noticed, not with commentary, but with recalibration. Conversations shifted. Expectations softened. Some connections faded quietly when they realized I would no longer play my old role. Others deepened, built on mutual regard rather than habit. That sorting felt inevitable, almost mechanical. When you change how you show up, relationships reorganize themselves. I thought about my son less often, not because he mattered less, but because my life had stopped orbiting around unresolved questions. When he did cross my mind, it wasn't with longing or resentment. It was with realism. I wished him well without attaching conditions to that wish. I hoped he would grow not because I needed it, but because growth makes life easier to carry. Living without the old story didn't make me smaller. It made me lighter. The future no longer felt like something to manage. It felt like something to enter, without scripts, without obligations inherited from earlier versions of myself. That openness was both freeing and grounding. It allowed me to move forward without dragging the past behind me. I didn't replace the old story with a new one. I stopped narrating altogether. And in that quiet, life continued steady, unremarkable, and finally, my own. The silence at the end of the story was not heavy. It was not the kind that follows loss or regret. It was the kind that settles after something has been fully understood and no longer needs to be explained. I recognized it immediately, not as absence, but as completion. There were no final conversations, no closing statements, no dramatic reconciliation or permanent severing. Life doesn't usually offer such clean punctuation. Instead, there was continuity, steady, ordinary days that asked nothing more from me than presence. And for the first time, that was enough. I no longer measured the distance between my son and me. Measurement implies comparison, and comparison implies longing. Longing had faded. What remained was acceptance, not resigned, not cold, but clear. The relationship existed in its current form, and I did not need to reshape it to validate my own worth. Silence had done what words never could. It had clarified roles. It had exposed expectations. It had returned responsibility to where it belonged. Most importantly, it had returned me to myself. I understood then that endings are not always moments. Sometimes they are conditions. You wake up one day and realize you are no longer waiting, no longer bracing, no longer explaining. That realization doesn't arrive with relief or sadness. It arrives with calm. And calm, I learned, is the most honest conclusion there is. If my son ever chooses to bridge the distance, the bridge will have to be built differently, not on obligation, not on assumption, but on mutual regard. Until then, the space remains not as punishment, not as protest, but as truth. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand understanding. I did not chase what had walked away. I let silence decide the ending, and silence chose peace.